Good morning, everyone. We're really happy to see you here. It's a first session of our Peace Week, and we're very thankful for Amber, who is here, who was really instrumental in helping to set all sessions. And I'm so happy that we're able to get so many guests for our Peace Weeks, but also for this very important session. This session have a lot of goals to start with. And while Ukraine experienced war for already over 2 years, and there are a lot of support and more call for support for Ukraine to protect its citizens, its territory, and help to continue and support the effort of Ukraine to stay independent and stay strong. Also, there are some more increasing negotiations and conversations about peace processes and how it can be achieved. And current research at the Carter School on Identity and Religion in Peace Processes, the part which I participated in, develop a systemic approach to peace processes, which have multiple systemic strategies, including strategies of inclusion, where different stories, different voices should be empowered and included in peace processes, including the assurance strategies, where people with different identities should receive opportunities for express their cultural heritage, express their rights for expression of their identity and their religion. So, and there are more specific comprehensive strategies. So what is important, what it's showing us, that any peace process between two countries also require conversation within each country and also require conversation across it. And stories of different people, of different groups are essential to make this peace process sustainable, make it effective. Of course, we see a lot of conversation in media that Ukraine is all pink now together, they all exactly the same, there is one opinion. But even in stories of our interviews, which we recently conducted, people telling that in Ukraine, if you have two Ukrainians, you have 3 Getmans, and you have a lot of, so it means that Ukrainians never agree with each other. This is like the most important part. So representation of different voices, representation of different experiences is the key, again, for successful peace processes. And this session brings complexity of Ukrainian reality, Ukrainian impact of the war, for our understanding how future peace processes, as soon as they will start, should include all these experiences. So I'm really happy to have today distinguished panel, and I will ask every participant present themselves, because how recording going, they just really show the face of person who is speaking. So I will ask in a way how we will be presenting. Gerard.
Morning, everyone. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech's campus in Arlington.
Thank you. Greta?
My name is Greta Uehling. I'm a teaching professor at the University of Michigan and a visiting scholar at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution.
Thank you. Oksana?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Oksana Myshuovska, and I'm a researcher at the University of Bern in Switzerland.
Thank you, Oksana. And Elina?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Elina Beketova. I'm a Democracy Fellow, Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, originally from Ukraine, Crimea.
Thank you very much. So what we will do today, we will ask each participant to speak for around 10 minutes, sharing the experiences of conducting research in Ukraine and presenting Ukrainian narratives, variety of them. And then we will have opportunity for each participant to maybe go and do some comments on everyone, and then we open it for questions by the audience. Thank you very much. Okay, let's start, Gerard.
Okay, so what I thought I would do is talk about how it is extremely difficult for those that are supporting Ukraine within Ukraine, in Ukraine, but especially the Ukraine support community, to countenance talking about territory. So why talking territory is taboo. And so I welcome, I've just kind of started on this research, and I welcome people's kind of feedback on this. What stimulated this research was a particular article which came out in the New York Times in September of last year by Stephen Erlinger, where he talks about the ways in which talk of negotiations has become nearly taboo. And that was, he had two particular examples. And one was the reaction to the news, which was broken by NBC News in July of 2023, that former US officials had held secret talks with prominent Russians, including Sergei Lavrov, at the United Nations when he was there to chair a United Nations Security Council meeting in April of this year. So news had broke in July about something that happened in April. And the two of the officials that met with him are very prominent foreign policy figures: Richard Haass, former president of the Council of Foreign Relations, as well as Charlie Kupchan. So that was the first thing that there was a strong reaction to on the part of the international community and of Ukrainians, of course. The second was the particular offhand remarks that were made by the Chief of Staff of the NATO Secretary General, Stian Jensen, that were made in August. They were offhand comments, which he later had to apologize for. And the offhand comments were in a question and answer session where he said that there's possibility, and he was actually responding to the frame that was already given to him by a tabloid journalist, that there was the possibility that that Ukraine could become a NATO member if it gave up some land. It was a sort of awkward construction, but nevertheless, this gets at the really crucial issue. How do you negotiate with someone who is the enemy? And here I want to kind of switch, if I can, to the kind of set of arguments that I want to make here. And this is the set of arguments. And so what I want to kind of suggest is that there are actually three very, very important storylines to grasp as to why it is extremely difficult to think about giving up territory in Ukraine. The first concerns memory, law, and norms, which is the memory of World War II, of territorial deals, of Nazi-Soviet pact, and how smaller states have been completely cut out of great geopolitical deals between great powers. And then also the memory of the Cold War too. This is a violation of the United Nations Charter. There's a territorial integrity norm, there's an indivisibility norm, and so all of these are sort of explanations which are grounded in law and grounded in the sort of deliberative processes in the ways in which, and you know, there is full or there's it's hegemonic in the international community that Russia has invaded Ukraine. So it's not that is the issue. The issue is what is the solution to that? And what I want to suggest is these particular storylines are holding together two very different storylines, two very different solutions. One is a solution which has Ukraine winning, so emphasis on victory of Ukraine, whereas the other is about preventing the defeat of Ukraine. Both of these are actually quite divergent, and the difference between them is sometimes obscured by these storylines. The second storyline is the affective one, which is one of just kind of revulsion at the particular war crimes that are happening, torture, what happened at Bucha, and the whole charge of genocide. And I think I don't need to explain that very well because it's already well known to people. It's extremely viscerally felt and deep. And that, of course, kind of prompted Zelensky's negotiation ban. It is why we see aversion in Ukrainian public opinion to any kind of negotiations with the enemy. The third one is how Ukraine is, and this is really for the support network for Ukraine, how Ukraine is positioned within the West as kind of representing things that are really central and sacred to the West. So a front line of global democracy versus autocracy, Ukraine as freedom's cause, that's how Joe Biden described it, Ukraine as core to the future of European security. So all of those are sort of stories which are very familiar to us. But I want to argue that there are also psychological issues which are extremely important too. The first one is the commitment problem, and that is Russia has a past record of transgression, and so therefore the idea that you could negotiate with someone who has been a serial transgressor is one that is irrational. So this is the kind of classic bargaining dilemma. And there's whole sets of commitment problems, and there's a large literature on that. The second one is sort of what is called in the literature hawkish biases, and this is prospect theory, where there's an endowment effect and there's loss aversion. And then there's a whole set of things that go along with that, risky behavior in a domain of losses, and then reactive devaluation. So every proposal you get, once you hear who it's from, you immediately devalue it. Now, all of these, I think, are really very, very powerful and very important to grasp so that we are able to understand as researchers why it is extremely difficult to countenance negotiations with Russia on the part of Ukrainians, and why why this is something that is extremely challenging. There is a discursive policing around this, and anyone who is engaged in negotiations, there's often ad hominem attacks on that, and so Haas and others have testified to that. And then there's a certain conspiracism too, that so-and-so was articulating Kremlin talking points and the like. I think that's also familiar to you. What I think is important to grasp here is that there are a series of really crucial dilemmas here. And there's an really crucial ethical issue. And I'm going to end on that. And that is that something that is righteous can be ruinous. And it is something that we as kind of researchers have to try to probe, but probe in ways that are extremely empathetic to the ways in which having any kind of negotiations involving territorial concessions is anathema to most Ukrainians. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. As always, very great and systemic. So we'll be moving into to Greta. Greta, let me open your presentation.
I can.
Oh, okay, wonderful. So
Yeah.
just let me know next when to move to next slide.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here for Peace Week this year. So my talk today is based on research I did as a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine between 2015 and 2017 that resulted in the publication of the book that you see on the right, Everyday War. And if you're interested in that, you can find PDF copies in libraries, and you can find it anywhere books are sold. This book really explores the social practices that respond to occupation, violence, and the seizure of territory that is the theme of our panel. And you can go to the next slide, which just briefly describes my research. So as an anthropologist, I did ethnographic research comprised of participant observation and over 150 interviews across Ukraine, with a particular focus on the population displacement that was occurring from Russian occupation of both the southern province of Crimea and the eastern area of Donbass. So as most people here will probably know, the war that is so prominent today is really best viewed as a continuation and an escalation of the unlawful seizure of Crimea. And that's kind of where I want to start today. One of my key findings throughout the research was that among the people who had fled both areas, the majority reported the destruction of personal relationships as one of the most troubling features of that initial phase prior to the full-scale invasion of the war. So 67% across the total sample lost friendships. And we can go to the next slide so that I can give one example, which is the story of a Crimean Tatar named Seleme. She was a single mother of a Crimean Tatar ethnicity, living with her school-age son when the occupation forces moved in. And throughout her life, she had really cultivated nurturing relationships with people of all different ethnicities on the peninsula. And a really close bond had formed with a family that identified as Russian, lived on her street, had a boy about the same age. But their relationship unraveled very quickly as soon as the occupation occurred. And what she described to me is basically, my friends have stopped talking to me. The ones that slept at my house, ate there, drank there, now we're crazies for remaining loyal to Ukraine. And they say that we're traitors and they hate us. And she had cared for this neighbor's child as if it was her own. So this was very destabilizing to her relational world, her network. And I think that her experience really exemplifies how the inception of that war that now unfurls altered and in some cases destroyed not only political, but also personal relationships. And significantly, the loss of these friendships became a major factor influencing decisions to leave Crimea. Seleme left with her son when she could no longer live with the acrimony. So these relationships really matter. And we can probably come back to this later, but one of the things that was interesting about accusations of treason at that beginning phase was they had very little to do with ethnicity and everything to do with political opinion. So Russians, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars were all accused of being treasonous traitors. Okay, so not only were friendships ended, but romantic partnerships and families. And let's go to the next slide so I can give an example of a Ukrainian woman named Oksana. Oksana also recalled the circumstances of her flight from Crimea through personal relationships. she recounted how she ended her engagement to her fiance after 9 years of cohabitation, because the father of her boyfriend and also her boyfriend was very pro-Russian, and she started sensing condescension towards her when they came home from the referendum. But it also spread to other relationships. And when she sensed disrespect within her own household, she felt like it was just the last straw, and she severed the relationship, and it was the end of potentially a marriage. So I call this everyday war because relationships sort of became microcosms of international relations. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's a military, humanitarian, and geopolitical crisis, but it's also a relational crisis that affects millions of Russians and Ukrainians. And attending to this is important because it's less studied than other dimensions of conflict. And also it's one of the secrets that's hiding in plain sight when it comes to pathways towards reconciliation, which I'll get to towards the end. So let's go to the next slide, which is about, as an example of a family disruption. Okay, so Victor, so a majority of the people that I interviewed reported that their family relationships had been adversely affected and were plagued by new tensions. And probably one of the clearest examples of that is a man named Victor, who I met picking through clothing at a humanitarian shelter in government-controlled Ukraine. And he told me that his father became angry and told him, "You are no longer my son," when he learned that Victor had not participated in the Crimean referendum approving joining Russia. So Victor left Crimea as a result of this argument and found himself living in the homeless shelter pictured in the image. Losing contact with his family was very painful, but this pain was exacerbated by its implications for his well-being more generally. Had he stayed, he would have been in a position to inherit his father's home and orchard. So in the example of Salome and Oksana, we see how the politics of relationships shaped internal displacement. And in his example, we see how they shape inheritance, ownership, and wealth. Okay, so let us move next to everyday peace. The next slide. And so it's fairly logical here that not only did relationships become microcosms of war, but they also became sites for everyday kinds of peace. And of course, the field of peace and conflict studies uses this concept of everyday peace to foreground the significance of non-elite actors like the civilians that I worked with in Ukraine. I think that Oleg takes us deeper into this process. He was a politically active member of a Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian political party. And so when Russian-backed separatists secured power in that region, they came to arrest him. And he basically opened his front door one morning to 4 men clad in black balaclavas, civilian clothing, who told him to come with them. And he cooperated because he did not want his wife to be harmed in any way. As soon as he was in his front yard, however, he made a run for it. He tried to escape. At that point, they shoot him in the back to bring him down, throw him in their basement jail, where he is treated for his wounds, lives for approximately a month before they release him. Now, it gets very interesting because when I interviewed Oleg, he said that he was only too happy to be in touch with his former attackers. In fact, he'd started to speak with them on Skype periodically, and he had even given one of them the use of the car that he had left behind when he was released and fled to government-controlled Ukraine. And I asked him, like, what explains this remarkable ability to cultivate an everyday kind of peace with these people who had harmed him so severely. And he explained that, for one thing, it was his faith. He felt any punishment was left to the Almighty. And he also viewed these political positionings as sort of epiphenomenal. He felt that his attackers, the people who shot him, might change their stripes again in the future. And indeed, that turned out to be true. And then the third reason was that he viewed them as future neighbors and future friends. He hoped, at least, to be able to go back. And so I think that his story really highlights the practical value of connections cultivated among civilians. And this is also important because, Ukraine is not the only politically divided society today. From Hong Kong to Houston, the UK during Brexit to Ukraine, families and friendships are disrupted, and family and friends find themselves unable to speak to one another authentically sometimes. So my overall point is that although they are not well reflected in the multi-track diplomacy system, and although they are implicit and like only subcategories in the everyday peace indicators so far, I think that two-person interpersonal relationships can be leveraged for war and peace. And I have a conclusion slide there that sums it all up before I close up. Yes, there we go. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I will stop share and we will ask Oksana, and I will need to open. Does it work?
Yeah, thank you so much, Karina. First of all, I also would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate in the Peace Week and share part of my research. I would like to ask you, Karina, if possible, to go quickly through the first four slides. Just they present very generally my theoretical approach. So my paper is positioned within the field of social psychology, looking at the role of socio-psychological factors in conflict escalation. Yeah, just these are just, I will not, as we have little time, I will not stop at this, just to present my,
just tell me
yes,
next.
just to present the theoretical framework. And in particularly, I'm looking at the conflict supporting and peace supporting narratives, drawing on Bartal and a number of other authors. So if you just go quickly through the first four slides, so just I will not stop on them. This is just presents what are conflict supporting and peace supporting narratives, what they are about. So what is the focus of my research? In my research, I'm asking the question how the narratives of those who are supporting inclusive peace and peace through meeting the needs of all sides, how is it constructed narratively? Meaning this, how they are structured using the theory of an approach of narrative analysis of Riesman, events, how they are being structured, how is the history of conflict is being presented. Second, what are the concrete factors and vision of conflict transformation, visions of peace, victory, and so on, and also the use of historical memory. And chosen traumas, how they are integrated into the narratives of groups, individuals who support inclusive peace and peace meeting the needs of all sides. Then I'm also drawing on the research which already has been done in other contexts, which looks at motivations, identities of groups of peace activists. So I'm drawing here on the research by Rafferty in Northern Ireland, which is helpful. It's both also positioned in the overall field of social psychology and also looking at agency of peace activists. Next slide, please. So in terms of primary sources, what I have been, the data which I have collected, I have interviews with former and present peace building activists, those who are still remain peace activists and those who have transitioned to different roles. And of these interviews I'm collecting both in Ukraine and in the territory, which is now I'm calling the former non-government controlled territories, which is now referred to as occupied territories. But these territories are very different because these are the territories which have experienced double violence. First, the violence of 1914 till 2022 and in the post-February period. And memories and narratives are very different from what would be the research targeting the so-called newly occupied territories with still the terminology which is being discussed. Second, I have been collecting data from media and social media, all discussions taking place in Ukraine, and especially that was more on social media, less so on media, about opinions supporting a negotiated peace and meeting the needs of all sides. So also I have been collecting the discussions, both in the comment sections when it was posted on media and on social media, also what were the reactions when there was a post proposing a solution to the conflict through a peace negotiations. And finally, I have been collecting a number of reports, opinion pieces, and so on that have been published globally. And here I just provide several examples, those who have advocated for negotiated solution. And also here I'm using narrative analysis to analyze how the history of the conflict has been presented, factors leading to conflict, and so on. Next slide, please. Today I will just present, as we have little time, I will just present my analysis of interview data because I think this is the most interesting, but also in parallel I'm doing this analysis of other social media, and more broader global analysis of narratives. But what I'm going to present briefly today is interviews, as I mentioned, collected both in Ukraine and in the former non-government controlled areas. First, what we see that there has been shift to what Ramsbotam would call radicalized disagreement, where has been within even this community of peace activists who were peace activists during the period before February 2022, there has been important shift to more, so to say, mutually opposed narratives. And just if we boil down what were the key issues in these narratives and shift of narratives, this is the vision of the Maidan revolution, of course, the beginning of the conflict interpreted very differently, where in interviews in Ukraine, it became a prevalent vision, just collapse all of the complexities in the origin and development of conflict from 2014 till 2022, and just saying this war started in 2014 with the Russian aggression in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. And on the other side, the narrative also with kind of this radicalized disagreement narrative where the war started because of Ukrainian government used force instead of dialogue and accommodation of demands of protesters and activists in southern and eastern Ukraine. Historical memory is also very important. It comes across in a number of interviews where on the Ukrainian side, the narratives of the Soviet past, about grievances, violations of human rights, and what is called unpunished Soviet crimes, Russian imperialism, which are becoming very prominent. And on the other side, this exclusive nationalism, also as referring to historical development, the conflict of 1940s, 1950s also has been prominent. The other analysis pertains to more nuanced narratives within interviews, and this as overarching what my research is showing, that those who support negotiated solution have much more nuanced narratives of the conflict development, histories on the conflict, the use of history, and so on. And what in the narratives on the Ukrainian side, the history of the conflict is presented as mutual escalation and radicalization by all sides, the failure of implementation of peace agreements on all sides, just not putting all responsibility on one side in the conflict. Also, there are nuanced, very nuanced visions about victory, which you do not hear publicly, but which are visible in interviews, just saying we will not fight until the last Ukrainian, just meaning that a revision of the vision of this total victory and just acknowledgement that Ukraine cannot win this war militarily with Russia. In the non-government controlled areas, also these more nuanced narratives, there is still a community which supports a peaceful conflict resolution, who are still continuing to be involved in peace work. And still there are several key points like these most dividing, where there is radicalized disagreement like about the Maidan protest. The more nuanced narratives is just that violence was mutual, and the force also the acknowledgement that there is not sufficient acknowledgement of the use of violence by the radical protesters during the Maidan protest. Then there is also the narrative of victimhood, and just the interviewees mentioning that they really against this competition of victimhood, where they feel that now the suffering of the people in the Donbass area is being overwhelmed by the new post-February 22 phase, where there may not anymore the space for the presentation also of the suffering of civilians and victimhood during this period. And also there are narratives which say that even given that there were substantial grievances on both sides, they do not legitimize this massive use of force by Russia from February 2022. And now I'm moving to my conclusions. Last slide. Thank you. What I have seen during these interviews, that opinions of individuals who have been advocating for a negotiated solution, both in Ukraine and in the former non-government controlled areas, have been marginalized and silenced. During the interviews, some interviews supporting a negotiated solution, they reported self-censorship. Not being invited anymore to media interviews. So in the past, as they had a lot of public visibility, they said that in the last 2 years, they really have disappeared. They have not been invited anymore to present their opinions publicly. There were some cases of peace activists being summoned by the SBU to ask them questions about their positions, and also self-silencing due to societal pressure. Overall, this research just shows how much interviews as a method of research are important, because what we see publicly does not show really what are the opinions. And just I would like also to add, there is a very similar opinion by Anatol Lieven, who visited Ukraine in April 2023, and who just noted that in private conversations, there were many more nuances about the evolution of the conflict and the solution, especially to what Gerard mentioned about the concessions of territories, that it also highlights just how important it is to kind of use the methods which can give the space also to the opinions which cannot be publicly expressed at the current point of conflict. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And we have Elina. Elina, do you need to share screen?
Yes. I will share it. Just a second. Well, at first, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for this invitation to the Carter School and Dr. Korostelina for inviting me to speak here. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, so before probably we delve into the details of stories from the war, I would like to thank all the participants and organizers for this panel discussion and really insightful and interesting analysis here. And I would like to say just a few words about myself, probably. My name is Elina Beketova. I'm a democracy fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Originally, I'm from Crimea, Ukraine, and I studied journalism in Kharkiv National University and the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. After my broadcast journalism career in Kharkiv and then Kiev, I started studies in clinical psychology. I wanted to become a therapist, but the Russian invasion kind of halted those plans. I fled Ukraine in March 2022, and now I'm based in Washington, D.C. and focus on researching temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories and authoritarian threats. What do I usually do? I have my series of Behind the Lines. This is a project about the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories, where I interview people, governors, Ukrainian governors from these territories, advisors, mayors who unfortunately fled from these territories, people living there or who fled. I have a tracker, which is called Behind the Lines. I research here a few issues: economy, humanitarian crisis, militarization, propaganda, resistance, Russification, and war crimes. Well, basically, as we all know, we can label everything that is going on in the temporarily occupied territory as a war crime, but I have decided to distinguish. So if we put here Russification, for instance, we can see some of the examples that happen in newly occupied territories, as Zaporizhia, as Kherson Oblast, and well, there are multiple cases. We all understand it. I just don't want to stop on it because we don't have time for that. But well, unfortunately, as we know, today marks the 761st day since the full-scale invasion, and there is no safe place in Ukraine and Crimea, which is my native land, which was illegally stolen 10 years ago, is being used for attacks on the mainland. Every day, Ukrainians have to deal with the trauma of loss, either emotional, losing their loved ones, or physical, losing their home. So life on the occupied territories adds more hardships. As you know, the war in Ukraine started 10 years ago with the annexation of Crimea. Then there were hostilities in Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. Since 2022, we have newly occupied Ukrainian territories, which is Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast. And well, the term temporarily occupied territories is used to describe these regions under occupation. What is the biggest problem there? As we all know, it's forbidden to be Ukrainian there. So if you speak Ukrainian, have a Ukrainian passport, or suddenly subscribed for Ukrainian websites on your Telegram, it can be a reason for your detention. There are more than 20,000 cases of civilians held as hostages in Russian-controlled territories. Unfortunately, there is no access to them, and relatives don't know what is happening with them, and the international community also doesn't have the access to these territories. Only when these territories are liberated, according to Ukrainian officials, we can see the scale of atrocities or war crimes that happened on these territories. I'd like to share just a few cases that I wrote about in Behind the Lines. So, for instance, Linie Umerova is a 26-year-old Ukrainian citizen from Crimea. She has been held without trial for a year and 3 months, including 10 months in the FSB Lefortovo detention center on suspicion of espionage. The charge could result in a 20-year sentence, 20 years prison sentence. Well, the reason for that, she wanted to visit her sick dad in December 2022 in Crimea, and she was going through the border with Russia and Georgia, and she was detained there. She was the only passenger on the bus who didn't have a Russian passport, her brother then explained. And according to Russian laws, all the people who have the Crimean registration but don't have Russian passports are subjects to additional interrogations. And unfortunately, after they saw that she has only Ukrainian passport, they started asking her questions, and then they found some information on her phone and laptop and that they didn't like. After interrogation, Sumerova was detained, and since then she was not released. Before the full-scale invasion, she worked as a social media manager for a Ukrainian clothing brand. Another case, Irina Danilovich, she is a woman, human rights defender and civic journalist who exposed problems of the healthcare system in Crimea. She was abducted in Koktebel, Crimea on April 29, 2022, the same day Russian SWAT raided her house and confiscated her electronics. Her whereabouts remained unknown for 13 days until her attorney found her in a detention center in Simferopol. On December of this year, 2022, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison for allegedly illegal acquisition, transfer, sale, storage, transportation, shipment, or carrying of explosive or explosive devices. Unfortunately, Russian forces use all the pretexts, all the false allegations to detain a person then accused of something. So on February 20, 2024, this year, her father said that she continued to suffer from severe headaches and migraines and ear pains resulting from prolonged ear infection. Despite her health conditions, Irina can't access medication in the penal colony number 7 in Zelenokumsk in the Stavropol region of Russia. Then another case, Ilya Matviyenko, he's 12 years old. When his hometown of Mariupol was shelled by the Russian soldiers, his mother died from the debris. The boy received many shrapnel injuries. Russian soldiers took him to a hospital in Donetsk. He told afterwards that they told him that he should say not glory to Ukraine, but glory to Ukraine as part of Russia, and forced him to write in Russian. Thanks to a team of governmental and non-governmental organizations in Ukraine, in close cooperation with the boy's grandmother, Elina, Ilya managed to be returned from deportation. Currently, the boy is undergoing rehabilitation and dreams of becoming a doctor to be the same as our boys on the front lines, combat medics and ordinary ones. They are real heroes. Unfortunately, we can't interview kids due to their re-traumatization, but their stories are available on the governmental website that is called Children of the War, where you can read all the stories of those kids. So as I have said, occupying the land, Russian forces use 4 strategies to raise the Ukrainian identity: Russification, conscription, militarization of education, propaganda. I won't stop on too much on it because I understand that we have people here who research these topics, but for those of you who might not know, unfortunately, passportization takes place in different forms. So recent news, the occupying authorities have toughened the rules of the free medical treatment. To access healthcare, it is necessary to have an insurance certificate. But to get this certificate, you need to have a Russian passport. So if a person stayed on the temporarily occupied territories, unfortunately, it's not possible to get a free aid. They say that there is some emergency in some of the Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast, but it's very hard to get it without the Russian passport. Different types of cultural projects with other regions in Russia, so-called adoption programs for new regions of Russia exist right now. I wrote about it in the Behind the Lines project, just don't want to stop on it. Then important specialists from Russia to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. There is a shortage of specialists in Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast especially. That is why Russians need to import specialists from mainland of Russia, from different regions, so that they could work there. But as I spoke with a few governors, they told me that specialists come for 2-3 days and then they have to leave. If we talk about doctors, they come just as a shift method. So they come for 3 days, for a week, and then they leave this territory because it's not safe to stay there. Then we observe all the types of militarization of education. There are different groups, camps, movement of the first. This is a version of the Soviet era pioneers with a mission to educate the patriotic spirit of youth, UnArmy. This is a Moscow-based military patriotic movement which prepares children to serve in the Russian armed forces. They are like all these types of camps and groups are opened in different state universities in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. They have all types of activities like team building event for young people in occupied Berdyansk. So, for instance, special forces soldiers from Russia provide classes in medicine, combat, shooting and operating drones, treatment camps and educational trips to the Russian Federation to re-educate and Russify young Ukrainians. Unfortunately, for patriotic education of youth, Russia allocated about $470 million for all these programs. That is why they are highly supported in Russia, and they want to spread all these narratives in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. And the last, but probably not the least, unfortunately, militarization, because we understand that people in the temporarily occupied territories are being conscripted in the ranks of the Russian army. As of July 2023, Russia forcibly mobilized 55 to 60,000 men into its army. It's according to the defense intelligence, but we understand that those numbers may be even higher. And right now, after the sham elections, of course, they will be higher. All types of Kazakh, Cadet, and other uniformed quasi-military organizations at schools, volunteer battalions as Battalion of Margelova, Sudoplatov battalions, all of that, unfortunately, we observe in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. But if you want to know more, please visit CEP.org. Behind the lines, there is this tracker, and there are articles where I write about all these processes. So at this point, that's it. Thank you so much. I will stop. No.
Thank you very much. And let me share. It's very good that you just talk about it, so I can. Okay, so I also will speak about experience on occupied territories. What I really want to stress from this presentation is that Ukraine will need to deal with it. There are some already existing former occupied territories in Kharkiv which were freed. There are probably will be more territories, and this approach to occupied territories is very important part of the peace processes. As an Oksana shows, there are multiple variations in stories. So this presentation actually built, I'm really glad, on Oksana's and what Elina told. So the results of it is the project which Gerard and me had at the Ukraine, based on National Science Foundation. And part of this project, in addition to surveys, we conducted 90 interviews in people in Eastern Ukraine to access their review of peace and war. And quickly about this theoretical approach, the question is how experience of war impact support for war or peace, how it's impact, how people see negotiations and so on. And there are very different actually results in and positions within the academic community. Literature show no consensus about it. There are some which show that, for example, in Colombia, that experience of violence increased support for peace. But other scholars show that previous experience have no associations with it. Similarly, we see the direction of effect, and some studies show that it can increase it, and some studies see that if people have more experience of war, then they more support in war, continuous war. Some studies show it's more supporting peace. So there are a lot of absence of consensus. It's how people see its impact and how see direction of impact. We recently prepared a paper based on surveys, which is coming soon, and in Peace and Conflict Journal, using surveys, but I wanted also to explore this topic through the interview. And so what this presentation is to show in part of this exploration. This is the world cloud for experiences of Russian occupation. And as you see, there are there is no communication, control of population, as Elina showed very well. There are some discussions that it was sudden, but people speak about a lot about violence, cooperation of local people. I will go a little bit deeper into this representation. So there are 5 major themes which came from experience of Russian occupation from people who were able to escape but lived under occupation. It's sudden nature of occupation, conditions under occupations, violence, Russian policies and reactions of local populations. A lot of people stress sudden nature of occupation. For example, one person is telling, well, that a tank have arrived and we were like, those tank, that says not ours. Then we also learned by word, by mouth, that they were coming from the other side of the village. And in the evening of March 3rd, almost everyone had a tank in their yard. So suddenly it happened. No one had time to do anything, no measures, no preparation for it at all. It happened very suddenly. And people saw it completely unexpected. I didn't believe until the last moment. Conditions under occupations were described in 3 major clusters: economic situation, security, and moral. Economic situations were described as poor economic condition, unemployment, empty shelves, high prices. For example, they turned off our lights for about 2 or 3 weeks. We were completely without light. There were very long lines in the stores. I will not say anything about money or medicine because there were none of them anymore. Everything is closed, the stores are empty, everything is empty. There are lines. If you need bread, you wake up early in the morning, go in line, get this bread. Then we see a lot of discussion, absence of security, checking phones, as Elina told very story, looting. That is, we realized we were occupied, and we realized that I would go now, and I don't know whether I will come back alive or not. Women were telling they were not putting makeup or making their hair nice because they were afraid of sexual harassment. And moral situation. A lot of participants describe moral, psychological pressure, fear to express their views and positions. And we had a kind of a rally in front of the office, right in front of them. But it's clear that the conversation was short. And they answered any argument, any questions, where we will shoot you all. That's all they said. And another quote, I associate this period with cold because it was cold outside and my soul was cold. Third theme, it's a violence with direct violence, which include provoked beating, rape, murder. They were very graphic descriptions of what happened. I didn't include it here, but here's one quote. They just went into the houses and just shot an entire family in the neighborhood with small children. People detained, tortured, got missing. Then we see a lot of humiliation, discussion of humiliation as a systemic action to impose, dishonor, dehumanize, and humiliate Ukrainian people. A lot of people really stress the systemic nature of this process. And this is what I was nobody there, and there was no name for me. It's just lawless. lawlessness. I think it was something like a testimony of some kind of power over us, that you nobody here and you have no name. Description of looting and destruction. Russian forces were based in the center of the village. They destroy all the shops, they bomb everything, they looted everything. And another quote, we're just sitting at home, we know that at any moment somebody can come and just look for everything, absolutely every drawer in your house, look everywhere. And a lot of description about seizing of property, of people who left, or sometimes people will just push out of their houses. There is nothing left there at all because they take it all, take away, steal it, and everything is stolen. Fourth theme is Russian policies of occupation. A lot of people speaking about disinformation. People had already listened to the president, the Russian president, and they were subject to manipulation from the Russian side. The people are zombies. Another is integration into Russian system, a strong pressure to accept Russian citizenship. Elina showed very well this idea of how Russian systemically imposing passport system. The occupied territories are putting people in front of the facts, either sign agreement or get a Russian passport. Or you simply won't survive in this territory. You won't be allowed to go to the hospital. You won't be allowed anywhere. And also a lot of new economic, financial system, pressure to use Russian currency. There are the establishment of new local institutions. They already appointed governors. People agreed to cooperate, have come district governors, and hold some leadership positions. And finally, this is an interesting approach to a discussion of forced referendum on territories, which show us differences of voices, which the most important, I think, for this session to stress. When there were kind of referendum, but not a referendum, they also went door to door and said, come on, let's do the referendum, let's go to referendum. But most people, same people, refused. But also another voice is speaking, and my very close friends, acquaintances, relatives, who went to say the referendum, and in fact they wanted, and many want to go to Russia. And finally, theme number 5, it's reaction of local populations. We see 3 major clusters of these reactions, from refusal to positive submission and cooperation. Refusal really connected with people trying to connect to Ukraine, trying to be connected to Ukraine, or leave territory as soon as it becomes possible because of multiple checkpoints and so on. When the power came back on, we had satellite TV, we had Ukrainian channels, we watched what's going on. I had a picture of my head now with a map of Ukraine on TV and what part is occupied. So people wanted to feel connected for that. And another story that is important, that my child, he decided to study. He said, I will not study under occupied territory. We decided to leave. But a lot of people show passive submission. For example, one quote, people have to get those Russian passports so that they can get their pension paid, because people have to leave somehow. If it was a month or 2, I think, or even 6 months, you could still leave somehow. But then it's been 2 years, it's very difficult, and you have to. And another quote, there are, I think, some adequate people who just didn't want to live for their own reasons. They're old or have sick parents or something else. Someone needs to treat his parent, he cannot take them out. So these people discussing why people are not living, who support Ukraine but still living there. And finally, there are stories of cooperation. A lot of people start shifting, going the side of occupiers. Russian came and issued a passport and destroyed the Ukrainian one, or threw it away and took a Russian one. So again, remember, the stories are, this interviews people who escaped, who decided to leave, and now tell stories about occupation. So the most interesting was to see how perception of integration depends on this experience. Are people who experience occupation and people who did not experience occupation see policies toward integration, possibility of integration the same way? As you see for this word cloud, it's not actually true. We see differences, and I will go quickly with some examples. It's just even world cloud show us that people who experience occupation really emphasize need to survive under Russia. They emphasize propaganda. They emphasize that it's a difficult process, but they also see again this occupied territory as a part of Ukraine. People who have no experience of occupation, for them the most important see it as a part of Ukraine, but they also emphasize the idea that it's people's choice. They put responsibility, much more responsibility on people for their choice without understanding. I think this is the key here, this really emphasis on people's choice versus idea of the need to survive under Russian occupation, which will impact policies. So what you see here with the integration of territory, people who had no experience of occupation, they all agree that occupied area must be integrated. Just as these territories are left us, they can and will be returned because they're still ours, and the people there all have their own position, just like we do on our territories. They stress importance of Ukrainization in response to Russification, but we are still one, and in the case that we get our territories back, we will pursue our policy in the same way, Ukrainization. I believe that everything will fall into place sooner or later. So there's a very strong discussion that everyone have to go through this process of bringing Ukrainian institutions and Ukrainian language. And also, but some people discuss prioritizations, and it seems to me that now the task will become even more difficult against the background of huge material, human, economic losses in our country. The question of reintegration will probably not be as significant. Now, if we compare it with participants who had experience of occupation, they express much more concern, as Oksana shows, a much more complex view on that. And they show that population still will be willing to rejoin Ukraine. They have a concern after being in occupation for so long. There may be some phenomena that are completely unimaginable to us right now. On the basis of this, it is necessary to develop some kinds of strategy. Who agrees, say, to undergo some kind of illustration? This talk is still quite abstract. So there are more discussions how the strategy should be developed, that it should be very thoughtful and well designed. Also, if we speak about punishment and how to deal with pro-Russian population on territories, there are also disagreements. People who didn't have experience of occupation emphasize punishment. Of course, we would like to see at least those who contributed most to strengthening the position of Russian punished, to receive, I don't know, some kind of sentence or something. There will be no difference if a person, for example, took the same Russian passport by force, or if he took it first as soon as opportunity arose. So we see this very homogeneous approach to all Russian population without, as I strong understanding of the pressure on population. Also toward the pro-Russian population, and those who are now very pro-Russian, seems to me they won't be able to change their minds for them will be one option: go to Russia, because it will be difficult to melt them back to reshape the Ukrainians. However, participants who had experience of occupation, they have again more nuanced and more approach based on understanding of what really going on, and how propaganda, they really stress propaganda in a lot of their descriptions and Russian enforcement. To be honest, I don't know. Somehow they will have to be re-educated. But we will definitely have to make sure that they will do not interfere in any way, that they do not become kind of network that helps Russian authorities. Perhaps as you do not share this opinion up to point of sending them to Russia to hang out, but territory is Ukrainian, and people stressing that we need to. And interesting, this particular quote shows that people see this different approach and they're trying to have a dialogue about that. And well, I think there should be any violent ways. By the fact that these are the Ukrainian territories, there is no doubt about it, and a lot of stressing that they are Ukrainian people. However, then when we ask and I try to analyze how people see ending of the war, differences will less significant, very similar people. The only difference which were visible is people who have experience of occupation, they really stress importance of support for Ukraine from international organizations, and they really stress importance of timing, where the ability will come, while timing also important with people who have no experience of occupation. They stress more security of Ukraine as important of protection of population. Both of them speak about negotiation, and both of them, what is important, it's interesting that negotiation actually a little bit more pronounced by people who did not have experience of occupation. And also what we see that both of them experience pessimism. This is, again, I didn't go deeper into this analysis yet, it's post-coming attraction, but we see that people who were able to escape, even they were in the worst conditions, they still feel more satisfied and more happy that ability to escape, because they all have just recent experience of escape, while people who didn't have experience of occupation express more pessimism about that. Again, this shows us that there are much more opinions. There are the positions toward occupied territories, position toward minorities in Ukraine should be more nuanced and understanding. And I will stop sharing here. And as we have this form of roundtable, I would love to have each participant maybe spend 2 minutes and just give initial thoughts based on presentations. And if they have questions, we can have one more round before we open it to the public. So if we go the same way as we started, and Gerard, do you have please 2-3 minutes, your thought, your comments, if you have any questions or others.
Well, I thought the presentations were all fantastic and really learned a lot, and they give us a sense of the human costs of this war, the infuriating dimensions of it, the crimes, and how difficult it will be to promote reconciliation. I guess that one thing that interests me intellectually, and we've talked about this, Karina, is the ways in which there's the international arena and the expectations, or at least the sort of support network for Ukraine what that does to the agency of ordinary Ukrainians. Because if Ukraine is being held out as a sort of bastion for the West, that's too much to ask of ordinary Ukrainians. And if you want to have Ukrainian agency, what does that look like in a condition where you don't have an election, but you have all of these diversity of views, and you have this, horrible suffering, and it is, in one sense, it's too much to ask people to be very nuanced in conditions where they are, traumatized and just massively impacted by all of these changes. So obviously the situation is being affected by what's happening in this town, and the inability or the unwillingness of the House to pass legislation. And I think that is just, unconscionable. But it is affecting the mood in Ukraine in a dramatic way. So those are some comments that I would have.
Thank you. Greta?
Thank you. Yes, I really valued all of the presentations. They were all fascinating. And of course, a common denominator appears to be like attention to nuance, attention to Ukrainians' own views. And I was intrigued by Dr. Toal's sort of naming of the elephant in the room, that it's difficult to talk about negotiation in this particular context. And I wanted to hear more about his views of pathways and outcomes. I was also, I appreciated all of the presentations, but I was also very interested in Elina Beketova's discussion of what's going on, and wondering if she is tracking the children who are illegally deported from Ukraine or illegally removed from Ukrainian territory at that CP.org site, or perhaps through some other methodology. So those are sort of the two questions that got piqued for me. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you to the organizers for being able to participate in this panel, this roundtable.
Thank you. While we're going through this circle, right, our representation, if you have a question, you can also answer the question. If you already passed, we'll return back. So we'll just do it. Oksana?
My reflections also, I was fascinated by all of the discussions, and I saw many kind of parallels in some of the presentations with what I am doing. And for me, it was especially Gerard's presentation. I found a lot of parallels, and also in the way the newly occupied territories as approach in your Karina presentation, and Elina's presentation about using interviews to really get a variety of opinions, nuanced visions, and so on. But overarching theme for me is also the theme of negotiation and peace, which also came across all of the presentations, from Greta's everyday peace to understanding what you mentioned, Karina, was for me also very important in understanding, in challenging some of the major approaches of thinking about peace, and especially this ripeness theory, which is just repeated everywhere, that's without understanding, getting the data, what is really going on the ground, and if all of these theoretical assumptions which are repeated everywhere, if this is really what is going on the ground. And for me, this is a much larger question, with this broader picture which was painted by Gerard at the beginning, and also what you asked, what is coming from research, what I see from individuals who really are in a very difficult situation with many doubts and so on, who just lost and don't know, cannot find themselves, do not know what to do in these circumstances. But I think this broader question is something that I took out of today's discussion, and I really look forward to the result, just to see if we need to rethink, and if where is the discussion about peace and the end of conflict, where all of this discussion is going.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Elina?
Wait, sorry. Yeah. Thank you so much for everyone for wonderful presentations. And I agree that probably we will have, as well, Ukrainian government will have to have strategies to reintegrate all these territories. And I appreciate all the analysis on people who were under occupation vs those people who have never been there, because their opinions do vary and are very different. Even though when I speak with people from Ukraine, I see absolutely contrast opinions on that. And I understand, as a person from Crimea, I mean, I've experienced it twice in my life, basically, being from Crimea, then not living there because of the occupation of annexation, and then experiencing the war in Kiev. I understand that it's still possible to reintegrate absolutely different people from different regions of Ukraine. But for that, unfortunately, right now, Ukraine doesn't have the means because those lands are occupied, so Russian forces can do their strategies there, and they are doing it, what we see in all our researches, in all our analysis. So that is why I think that it's important to have these strategies, but I don't see that they can be implemented in the nearest time. What I have noticed is that Crimea question is more or less, we have different strategies on cognitive deoccupation of the peninsula, while Donbass doesn't have this. So I'm kind of wondering why we have less on Donbass than on Crimea, for example. And I just hope that Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast will be liberated sooner. On the question that I got from Greta, thank you so much for it. I wrote about race to rescue Ukraine in stolen children. Unfortunately, we have also 20,000 confirmed cases of children being abducted, but the number could be as high as 200,000. It's difficult to verify this information from the occupied territories. Moscow says that there are more than 100,000 Ukrainian children have been taken to Russia, and only around 400 were taken back to Ukrainian controlled territory. It's very hard to be involved in any type of returning of kids, because they say that there are like a couple of initiatives and organizations who are involved in it, but unfortunately we don't have the access to those territories, and that is why it's very hard to proceed with any activities. But I know that a lot of governmental and non-governmental Ukrainian and international organizations are involved in it. Thank you so much.
And Greta, if you're interested, Carter School signed now, we official partner with State Department Stabilization Office, Conflict Stabilization Office, and specifically Conflict Observatory, which actually was instrumental in supporting ICC indictment of Putin and several other people in Russia for abduction of children. So this is a Conflict Observatory who done this work in collaboration with Mitra. I'm very conscious of the timing, so just one more comment, and I want Gerard to answer this question. I really happy that what we had this conversation today, and unfortunately it's a short session, but I believe this is an opening of conversation, and I believe people who is here and some other people, I'm looking for future if we can have a workshop and something on this specifically, because the future of Ukraine not only depends on, of course, on some parts of fighting with Russia and maybe in negotiation with Russia, but also future of Ukraine depends on how Ukraine treats itself, its own population. the sustainability of the peace depends how different voices in Ukraine are presented in all these processes of peace processes within Ukraine. And this session today really showed us how important it is for Ukraine to develop civic meaning of national identity, not one ethnic blanket covering everyone in Ukraine. And this also was supported by multiple research. Again, I don't have time to speak about it. We'll return to it later. Gerard, do you want to answer the question? And maybe we can have one or two questions from the audience.
No, I think that's, it's a huge question Greta asked, and it's, yeah, so I've talked a lot. So let's hear what questions the audience might have for folks.
Okay, if people who are in audience, just put your hand up so I can unmute you, and if you have a question.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for the very informative presentations. I'm Shuchida, assistant professor of Waseda University in Tokyo. I have a question to Professor Toal. I think this question is related to the question of the Greta, but as an implication of your presentation, I would like to know your opinion. Do you think it's possible for political leaders in the primary parties, and especially in the West, to talk about peace talks or ceasefire agreement without talking about territorial concession of Ukraine? I think it's a matter of priorities such as peace first or territorial integrity first. So I'd like to know your opinion.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, that is possible. Their ceasefire is different from a peace treaty. And as you know, the Korean ceasefire agreement, that has been promoted as one potential option. There are others where you do not resolve the fundamental issues. I don't expect that Ukraine will ever concede Crimea and its particular border. So we may be in a condition where you have essentially a quote-unquote frozen conflict. What I would say about that is that in certain cases, and I'm thinking particularly of Bosnia, where I did research for about a decade, one of the difficulties of war is that it's much easier to destroy a place than rebuild a place. And so in many instances, places that the international community tried to reconstruct in post-war Bosnia and try to promote returns failed. And those places were destroyed forever and changed forever. And so one of the things that I think Ukrainians quite legitimately worry about is that the longer the occupation goes on, the more those places do not become Ukraine. They become Russia, they become something else. And that's a really legitimate fear. And so therefore, that's another reason why the idea of a ceasefire and a frozen conflict is not appealing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we have this another example which comes to mind is Alsace, right? The region which had forced Germanization and then back to, so this is I think very good examples of how some territories can be really perceived as legitimate part of each country, and this conflict of legitimacy really impacts population very strongly.
That's a much.
Do we have any? Go ahead.
Because you have Strasbourg now as the city of Europe, where Alsace-Lorraine really became a area for a reconciliation. So yes, that would be a positive outcome.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about positive examples. Something positive at the end of that. Yeah. So we have time for maybe one more question or comment from anyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so again, I'm very thankful for all participants. I really see that as a beginning of conversation. I think it's very important for us to get into nuances and understanding and representation and radical inclusion. And by radical inclusion, I mean really giving legitimacy to people who we didn't see legitimacy before. This would help in Northern Ireland, to include different representatives of different sectors, including business sectors, for example, happened in Colombia, to give opportunity for people of different who were perceived as rebels, for example, what happened in Sri Lanka, right? There are a lot of very specific experiences and strategies which make peace agreement systemic. And I think we're just opening conversation to discuss this, how Ukraine can think about sustainability of peace for the future. Thank you for all participants. Thank you for sharing problems, taboos, and varieties of views for that. And again, we will continue conversation and find some ways to continue it for the future. Thank you very much, and I will see everyone, I hope soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.